Hello, fellow Rosarians. Thank you for joining me today. I'm really hoping that you had time to watch part one of my collaboration with Jason from Fraser Valley Rose Farm. We had a really good time talking about some myths or some things that Rosarians choose to do in their gardens that are specific to them. They have found that it works, but you may not necessarily need to do it in your garden. So this is part two, where we continue to go through some of the information and confusion that you may find when you get one of the packing list flyers from a vendor of what you should do with that rose, but it kind of contradicts with maybe what another vendor sent you that you need to do in your garden. So let's go ahead and get into it and see what Jason has to say. All right, Jason, thank you so much for joining us today to go through where, when these newbies are ordering from the companies, they're getting lots of different information. And I know that whatever they hear you say is going to be like gold. And so I wanted to go through these things just to get your thoughts. So welcome, Jason.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about soaking those roses. I know we talked about that a little bit on yours, but is there a problem with dunking the entire rose?
Yeah, and I don't see a problem with that because the goal here is to rehydrate all the tissues within that rose. You're not going to harm anything by dunking it or soaking it for up to 24 hours. It's only for an extended period, I think, where if there's not enough oxygen reaching into the tissues that you could be causing a problem there. But for a 24-hour soak, I think you could go ahead and put in both the heads and the tails, so to speak.
Because I know that sometimes I get so many roses in my pool that they're on top of each other. And
oh, sure.
Yeah, I mean, so I try to have the canes out, but a lot of times that's not what's happening. So, when I'm looking at these, vendors, I think that they're going on their experience. And we kind of talked about that in your video, that everybody's going to have their own experience in their own environment and what works. And so when they put together this literature of how to plant this rose and take care of it, there's just a lot of confusion. And so with that, band size roses, they're saying that they want you to pot them up 1 to 2 sizes, get them up to 1 or 2 gallon size before you directly put them in ground. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that. That's the size of rose that I produce most on the farm here. So these are in this sort of 4-inch pots or 3.5-inch pots, and putting them into the garden that small, I think is just inviting. They're just not very resilient at that stage. So if you miss the watering by a little bit, or they're getting watered with the rest of the garden, they might be getting too much water, they might be getting too little water. If they face some kind of drought pressure or environmental pressure, they're just not very resilient to it at that size. So my experience has been, and it's certainly what I would do in my garden, is pot them up at least into a 1 gallon trade gallon, often even better into a 2 gallon. I want them to be as robust and have as much energy and as much tissue on them before they go into the ground. And that just gives them their best start in the garden. Now, if you're putting them into a container as a different thing, I would go ahead from the band into a medium container or a large container because it's potting soil, because you're controlling that a lot more closely with individual watering. I think that's pretty reasonable. But going into the garden, I'd say go with a larger pot.
If you're going to pot them up and put them into their 1 gallon, are you letting the roots totally fill that entire pot and then putting it in the 2 gallon and letting the roots? I just don't want anybody to think that they can put it in a 1 gallon for a hot second and 2 weeks later, let's put it in the ground.
No, I probably should be more specific about that. It's rooted to the sides and bottom of the pot. That's okay. My standard for next time I know that it's ready for either an up potting or to go into the ground, is it has to be at least loosely rooted and preferably well rooted to the sides and bottom of the pot.
And then with the, I think that the standard guidance is if you're going to pot a rose in a planter, that you want it to be a 20-inch by 20-inch pot. And so is it okay to take that little band and put it into the 20 by 20, as long as you're watching the watering situation and not just keeping it around the edges where they can't get to the little baby? What do you think?
Yeah, it's about the water. You're exactly right on there. It's about the water. I made a whole video on small plant, big pot, and the advantages and disadvantages. Did that on my channel. I'm totally plugging it now.
Let's link it up. We'll link it there for you.
It's just a matter of matching the correct watering for that thing. And you're right, not just getting the sides, but also the fact that a larger pot will tend to hold a lot more water and that the plant won't go through it so quickly. So I have to watch that too.
Oh, this was a fun one that I saw. It was a shock to me. You get a bare root and they've got these beautiful canes that might be, I don't know, 10 inches. Are you going to trim them?
No.
Yeah.
No. I mean, I guess, and I think I saw the same resources you did where somebody said, no, it's really important that you trim the canes before it goes into the ground. I'm like, heavens, the supplier of these plants went to a lot of trouble to give you that much cane and that much roots.
Yeah.
So knocking either one of them down unnecessarily would seem to me to be a waste of the plant's energy. Now, certainly you're looking for broken canes, you're looking for weak canes, you're looking for diseased canes. Certainly those, or if the tips are burned off, yeah, sure, go ahead and prune those. But if it's healthy tissue, I wouldn't take it off.
And I didn't either. I just loved those long canes and the beautiful roots, and so I left them.
If you can avoid stressing out the plant, either in transplant or when you're doing a bare root, which really is just a transplant, wherever you can avoid stress or leave energy in the plant, you're better off. So once again, the grower went to a lot of trouble to give you a big, long set of roots. Don't prune them unnecessarily. But I know that it's a practice here with one of our big suppliers to take that big bare root rose and trim it down a lot and stuff it into a little pot or into a body bag. And they're still good quality roses, but that does take a toll on the plant.
Now you're making me think about when I see root roses that have wax on the tips. What is with the wax? Why are they doing it? And what are the ramifications?
Well, it's an old practice. It's been around. I researched this a while back, and it's been around since I think at least the 1950s. So this is like a 70 or 80-year-old practice in roses. And at the time, it was followed from the idea that people would do pruning wax when they were doing their grafting or grafting wax. And so it kind of made sense. Well, if we're doing grafting wax to maintain the moisture, maintain the seal on a graft, then why wouldn't we do the same thing for bare root roses? And they went with it, and they've stayed with it. Now, the idea, I guess, is that it maintains the proper level of moisture inside of the tissues of the rose.
Okay.
And I don't know that there's any good evidence for that, but they've stuck with it. And I guess you'd have to ask them why have they stuck with it? I don't think there's anything intrinsically wrong with it. But you know that from that case that they put them in wax, that what they've also done is they put them into the cooler in the fall, and they've tried to hold them for a great period of time. And they thought that would help to maintain the quality of the plant. But, temperature, dryness, mold, all sorts of things can happen in the cooler. So I wouldn't necessarily say that the wax is the cause, but maybe it's not working the way that they think it should.
Yeah, I haven't had great luck, and I get real excited when I see people show these early roses that are coming in February now in the US. And I was preparing myself visually to see wax on the tips, and I'm seeing that maybe there's a change that's happening, and because they were showing these beautiful roses that didn't have the wax. And so I was excited that hopefully that's
I have two bare root suppliers that I use for the stuff that I can't propagate myself. One uses wax and one doesn't use wax, and there's no significant difference in the quality as far as I've seen. When I'm getting them promptly in spring, there's no significant difference in their performance in the garden.
Okay. And then tell me now, what do you do with the wax? Are you cutting it off?
No.
You just leave it?
I couldn't spare that amount of time. It will, over time, as the plant resumes growth.
It'll pop off.
It's out in the sun, it's out in the elements, it will peel away or become less prominent. So it'll be less ugly over time.
One of the websites that I was looking at said, roses need 6 hours of sunlight, ideal situations. I agree. But what about when they say that they will suffer if they're in the shade? Thoughts?
Well, they're not getting as much energy as they would want. That doesn't mean they're not getting as much as they need. And I guess it depends on how deep the shade is, right? So in some climates, warm climates, and you'll hear this from people in the South where they have a lot more heat or long blistering days, that a little bit of shade is not a bad thing. And a high shade, particularly high dappled shade, is really good, or afternoon shade is really good. So shade can be a positive thing. But if it's dense shade along the north side of your house, and it never gets any real amount of sun, I could see a rose going into decline for that. So you want to match the right rose to the right situation. Typically, and this is a rule of thumb I use, is those roses like the hybrid musks with the smaller flowers, they don't have those big high octane blooms. They can tolerate the shade just by their breeding a little bit easier. They have the multiflora in them, and so they can tolerate the shade a little bit more. So if you cheated down to 4 hours, or you only had dappled shade all day, or dappled sunlight all day, that might be the rose to choose for it. But for those big high octane grandifloras or English roses, more sun is better.
Well, and I agree with you. I'm thinking about the north side of our house by the road, and I have, some trees there, and it seems like those don't bloom as well that are underneath the tree. And so I was thinking about using OGRs. If the old garden roses are only going to bloom once a year, typically, and if that tree doesn't have a canopy over the winter and they're getting the nutrients and boosting up for that first flush, I'm kind of hoping that maybe an old garden rose, a one-time bloomer, could solve that location of being in the shade.
Sure. Yeah, the Elbas tend to do a little bit better
Okay.
in shady locations. As I mentioned, the hybrid musks, which aren't an OGR, but they have some characteristics like that. Maybe the noisettes or the tea noisettes would do okay with a little bit of shade.
Okay.
So those would be decent choices. The Scots roses, even though they will take blistering sun, tend to be pretty tolerant of shade. And then, of course, the species roses, again, not all, but some are a little more tolerant, especially if they're cluster flowering.
The next one that I wanted to talk about was planting distances. I know when I think about your garden that you have, everybody in their location, a lot of space between them to get around them. And I plant complete opposite to that. It's 28 to 30 inches apart. What is your feeling about spacing roses?
Yeah, and just to clarify about my own garden, you will see pictures of me or videos of me out in the rose field with the big spaces in between them. And that's the portion where these are the mother plants for my stock roses. And I do give them lots of space, and I want lots of space to fit the tractor between them. And this is for mowing and other practical reasons. You give them lots of air circulation and lots of sunshine for maximum performance. But in the garden, tighter is not bad. In fact, just about touching or just touching is not the worst thing for roses. And oftentimes I'll have other plants nearby as well. So crowding them in is not the worst thing, but it does depend on the variety. And what I'll say is, I looked at some of those spacing guidelines. They say Floribunda prescriptively must be either 24 or 30 inches apart, or whatever it is that they say. Well, that's not going to be as true for, say, Fellowship or Living Easy, which is a very large Floribunda, as it would be for, say, Iceberg, right? So it's going to depend on the plant. I would say aim to have them not quite touching is a pretty good measure.
Well, and what's interesting is when I really started looking at spacing guidelines, depending on which side I was looking at, if you want a look of, say, one big rose, you can put 3 together that are, closer, 3 feet or so apart, maybe even closer. But one of the websites said that they were planting them like 1 foot apart. And I was like, oh, wow, I can't imagine, because I do want to be able to kind of get in there, take out the dead, disease, damaged, open it up a little bit if I need to. But so I think that you're right, that it's variety specific and what your intent is.
Right, because if you're growing it as a hedge or a ground cover, well, then tight together works. Yeah. But if you're growing it for a specimen, that's a different matter.
Yeah, I remember I did a collaboration, and my folks that I was doing monthly meetings, and so the folks that were on my monthly meeting during the winter months will remember I got lit up by an expert because I plant so close, and he said that I was, causing, diseases and problems and things like that. And so I really did want to take a hard look at that. But did I move my roses? No.
Whose garden is it anyway?
What's that?
Whose garden is it anyway?
There you go. Excellent.
It's you who has to live with the consequences.
That's right.
And the truth is, a lot can be done to manage them, whether you have them a little bit tighter or whether you have them a little further apart. I've definitely seen, gardens where it's gotten so tight over time that there's no room to move around, and the plants aren't doing well because of it. But that's life. You live and you learn, right?
That's right. And you adjust as you go along. I agree. No matter what planting information that you're going to get from a vendor, they're going to ask you to amend your soil, but they don't know what your soil is. So for general guidance for newbies, because if you've been gardening for a long time, you probably kind of know your soil, but for our gardening newbies that are thinking about putting a plant in the soil, what do you recommend when they get that literature that says amend 50% compost?
Taking a hole and putting it in the ground and filling it with a bunch of organic stuff is a recipe for not such good things happening to your plant. That's my opinion. That organic matter that's in there, let's say it's compost or other amendments, manure, whatever, is going to break down over time. It's going to leave less density in that hole. It also has nutrients in it right now. And the last thing that your plant needs when it's just starting to try to get established is a big bloom of bacterial or fungal population, excess nutrients around those roots as they're trying to settle in. So I usually go with the native soil. I mean, now let's start with the question of, is your native soil, your native garden soil, reasonable? Is it well drained? Is it, workable? Is it too high a pH? I mean, there's reasons why you might consider doing a raised bed or improving the entire garden before you get going. There are sites that are bad enough that you would have to consider that. But if your site is reasonable, let's talk about getting your plants into the ground where they can start to establish. And there's nothing stopping you from improving your soil after they're in the ground. So once they're in there, well anchored. And remember, one of the main reasons why you're putting your root system, one of the main reasons why your root system is there is to anchor your plant, right? So if you have it with its native soil, there is no barrier or boundary layer between what's in the hole and what's in the rest of the garden. It can anchor inside, it can anchor outside. It's not acting like a little bathtub there. And then what you can do is after the fact, then you can add organic matter, nutrients to the top. You can add mulch to the top, and that's the way that nature improves soil. Is to add it to the top and then let it work its way self down through the soil. So that would be my approach. Unless you're going to improve the entire garden, I think it's not such a great idea to try to improve it just one hole at a time, right where your plant is. It causes drainage problems, causes rooting problems, causes all sorts of issues.
Because the water will kind of gravitate towards that area that is just nice and soft. And
if you have a clay soil and it doesn't drain well anywhere else, but you find this one spot that's full of organic matter, where do you think that water is going to go?
Yeah, exactly. And I think here in our clay soil, I've had great success with, what you said, putting the roses in the ground and then just tackle it every year. And I think that it was overwhelming initially when I see all these beautiful pictures of ideal soil that people have, that I didn't have that, but it will happen. And it'll happen quicker than I think that, people predict that it will. And it's just, every fall, throw down compost, put some gypsum in to soften things up, newspaper, cardboard, things like that. But it will happen. It takes time. What kind of soil do you have? Is it clay?
We're on the river bottom here, and it is a heavy silt that behaves like clay. Okay. So it's like a really fine silt. So you'll still get the cracking in the soil in the summer when it gets dry. That's what I get here. But when I've taken it and done the jar test, it comes up as like 70% silt. So it's not exactly clay, but but because the silt particle sizes are small, it kind of behaves like clay. That's what we have down by the riprap by the river, and it cracks. All right. Well, we kind of talked about this. I've seen people, because they're so desperate to amend their soil and they want to grab what they have, they put potting soil in their native soil. So I think that you address that. If you're planting a rose that has some potting soil around it, you shake off that extra potting soil and put it in. That's not a big problem, right? It will eventually integrate with the surrounding soil. But I wouldn't fill a hole in the garden with potting soil and treat it like a container. There's a reason why containers have potting soil and the ground has ground soil, and each perform a different function. So now let's talk about my question for containers. What if somebody has clay soil and they want to use native soil in their container? Yeah, I mean, similarly, I say they serve different functions. So when you have something in a pot or in a container, you're looking for certain features of it. One of them is that it's light. That's lightweight potting soil is light. It's meant to do that. It also has impeccable drainage. It's engineered to have impeccable drainage. And so, and because a lot of the nutrients from your plants in a small volume of soil, a lot of the nutrients are going to be coming from direct feeding, not so much from the organic breakdown, not as much. It's harder to manage with an organic amendment or organic release within that. So using something that is engineered as a soil for containers tends to do a better job. And I'll use a slow release fertilizer in that situation.
Well, and I think you're the one that taught me about pot culture. When you raised an eyebrow one time when you were talking about your propagations and your plantings that you were fertilizing once a week. And I thought, that's weird. I haven't done that. But now I totally embrace it. And it makes total sense that here you've got this planter that is, constantly being watered through, and it can, leach those nutrients.
Traditionally in large scale horticulture, like I'm not large scale, but they'll do something called fertigation, which is basically just fertilizer in the water, just the same way as you'd add Miracle-Gro. And they do either at every feeding or every second feeding is a low level of fertilizer in there, because there's really nothing in that potting soil. The potting soil isn't offering any fertilizer. So if you want your plants to have a constant supply of nutrients, you have to offer it either in a very small amount all the time or in a slightly more amount relatively frequently.
Okay, talking about fertilizer and new babies, one of the vendors is saying that you shouldn't use any fertilizer the first year unless it's liquid. So you're even being dinged if you use Biotone granular, which I use on everything. Do you use Biotone? I mean, it's a starter. I guess any kind of starter. No.
No, that's not my fertilizer, but I can understand what that supplier is trying to say because ultimately people kill their roses with kindness in the first year. They put them into those big pots or big holes in the ground with lots and lots of manure or fertilizer in it, which is a no-no. And then they also feed them, and you end up with burned roots and yellow foliage and just a sudden massive breakdown of the rose. Now, this doesn't happen all the time, and if you're following careful feeding guidelines, but I can understand from the rose vendor's point of view, what they're trying to say is, look, your rose comes to you really, really healthy. Let it establish, let it do its thing in the garden, and then you can resume at a later date. A little bit of careful fertilizing in the first year wouldn't be out of line. It would probably benefit the plant, but they're being cautious.
You should fertilize every 2 to 3 weeks with fish. But I think that in that case, they're talking about the ground, not potted. Not potted. And I can't imagine every 2 weeks. That just seems excessive versus once a month. I mean, I guess if you have time and money.
Right. And it's not a very, the way that they ask you to apply fish fertilizer by the dilution is not a very strong fertilizer when it comes down to it. Even in the bottle, even undiluted, it's only 5-1-1. So by the time you dilute it to package instructions, it's a pretty weak fertilizer. So you could probably get away with it. I mean, I say, I can't give you a frequency. You're in a clay soil, so you're finding once a month works for you. I would imagine a person with a sandier soil that doesn't retain nutrients quite so much might be saying, I need to do it a little bit more frequently to get performance out of my plants. And I can totally understand that. So I can't give you a frequency, but liquid fish fertilizer diluted is not a very strong fertilizer. So I could see how you get away with that, more frequently.
Somebody said you shouldn't prune your first or second year roses. I would agree with first because you don't have enough growth to prune back. But your second year roses, is there any benefit to not pruning?
I think you and I are thinking the same way along this. Is you prune as your plant needs it. You have goals for your plant, what you're trying to get it to do, right? One of the goals of pruning is to bring it down to a size so that you can enjoy it. It isn't too tall. You're not going to see that in a first year rose. You probably won't see that in a second year rose. But you could still engage in pruning for thinning. You could still engage in pruning for shape. You could still deadhead. That makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah. So I wouldn't put a ban on pruning. I've taken cuttings off of first and second year roses, no problem. Cheating ahead and getting some cuttings going. So I wouldn't say no, but you know that you're taking a toll on the plant as you prune in the first year, maybe even in the second year, but it depends on your climate. If you're in the American South, where things grow very, very quickly, you may have a rose that warrants a pruning for shape and size in its second year.
So one of the vendors have that out there that you never want to take off more than 1/3 of the growth from a rose ever.
Okay, well, who makes these rules?
I know.
You know, like well, what is 1/3? It's a fraction. I guess, again, rule of thumb, they're trying to be cautious. They're trying to say, don't stress out or hurt your plant by too much pruning. But 1/3 seems oddly specific. So
Yes.
I would take off, rule of thumb, just for shape and size.
Yeah.
Well, if your rose is 8 feet high, it's well established. I've taken that thing down to 16 inches,
Yes.
as it needs it, right? And so that's far more than 1/3. Is it the safest or most sensible thing to do? Well, it was the right thing to do for that rose, and I think that's what you look for. Again, I think I mentioned in the last video that we did about living easy as a floribunda in my garden. It must love this climate, or just does particularly well here, but it always jumps up from about a 2-foot cutback to about 5.5 to 6 feet in a year.
Oh, wow. Okay.
If I only took off 1/3, this thing would, year by year, be getting larger than I want it to be in the garden.
And a lot of people ask me, how do I keep my roses down? And so each flush that I have, I take at least 1/3 then. But I guess the problem is with this guidance, I don't want people to think that it's only 1/3 and never more, because when I do my spring prune, you better believe I'm taking them down to my knee height typically, because I want to clean everything up, get in there, and then let them take off. And they're usually, chest high by the time they're in their first flush. Let's talk about water real quick. Tell me your thoughts on, if it's in the ground, how often do you water? If it's in a pot, how often do you water?
And this is like me talking to you about fertilizer and saying, in your climate, you should fertilize every blank off, and I can't do it. If you have a sandy soil, you'll definitely need more water than you would need in a clay or a retentive soil. In containers, first thing in the season, it's raining all the time here, I skip it. And then once we get into a dry patch of the year, I'm probably aiming to put my roses into a size of pot where I can get away with watering them twice a week. That's what I'd like to do. And that's more an issue of not how often I'm watering, but what pot size I'm putting the plant into, right? Because if you put it into an appropriate pot size, you don't have to be watering it every single day. You want to get it up to the point where it has some reserve of water in that pot. In the ground, once again, rainy climate here, I don't touch them first thing in the spring. Last year, I didn't touch them until I think the second week of June, something along those lines. So I can't tell you a frequency, but once it dries out, then at that point in the ground, I was targeting about once a week.
Let me see what this guidance says here. Water new roses deeply once a day for a few months. Once established, give them water 2 to 3 times a week, depending on the season and the climate. And then another vendor says to do it once a week. And how many gallons are you giving it each time you water? Between 1, 3, or 5. And so I was like, man, they're going to drown these babies.
Yeah, that's a lot of water. And, you have to go with what works for your plants. And unfortunately, this is an issue where it comes down to how does a new rose grower understand, the signs, So one of the signs I look for on roses, if they're being underwatered, obviously they don't look as happy. The leaves don't look quite as glossy. You may also start to see some yellowing and dropping of foliage, typically towards the center and bottoms of the plant. That's sort of an early sign that they're moisture stressed. So those are some things you look for. Once you recognize those, you sort of get an idea of what your climate needs and what your plants need, and then you just gauge it by there based on the weather. But I don't think that it would be productive to say, rain or shine, 3 gallons of water every 3 days. It's going to work for some people, and for other people, it's going to be way too much.
Yeah. And so I think for me, like you said, I have clay, so it's going to hold on to the water. And so I once I put them in the ground, I don't pay them any attention at all and think that they even need water until we get the heat of the summer. And there's been a period of time without water. And my favorite go-to is a water meter. And I even use it in the ground plants, definitely in my potted plants, because I don't trust myself. And a lot of people say, oh, I can just put my finger in and tell if it needs water. Yeah, I mean, I can understand that guidance, but what about way down, and what if you've only watered maybe in one part? So anyways, I use a water meter for my potted plants and let that be the gauge to tell me. And then you can kind of make an educated decision as you're watching your things dry down when they need to be watered. But roses are so resilient in the ground that they can usually go for a short period. And you do want them to grow those roots, right? To not be dependent on you as the water source.
Yeah, I mean, the general rule of thumb that they say, deeper watering less often and than shallow watering more often is probably the better guideline to give people, at least in the ground.
This is crazy. Your plants will leaf out faster, and I could be really wrong. I want you to tell me if I am. Your plants will leaf out faster if you mist the canes as often as possible while they're getting started. Roses need plenty of moisture both above and below the soil to develop fully. I've never misted my canes hoping that they're going to grow. Thoughts?
Sounds like a lot of work, but inside a greenhouse doing commercial horticulture, that more humidity and more moisture means faster growth and lusher growth, right? So it'll work. It'll get you faster growth, but there are some downsides to having lots of moisture on your foliage all the time too, and that comes down to foliar disease, right? Yeah. So and do you really want fast, lush growth on your plants? Is that the goal? Because to me, it isn't. I want the appropriate growth for my climate.
Yeah.
So adding on a whole bunch more moisture, keeping them in a very closed, humid greenhouse, you've got the greenhouse effect. You get fast growth, but it isn't really going to produce the best growth for your climate outdoors.
Yeah, you want them to kind of get used to your native environment. And like I said, survival of the fittest, and they'll wake up when they're ready. Last one, how long do roses live? And so I'll caveat that by saying one site that I looked at, they didn't specify which rootstock that it was on, but it says most modern roses will give you at least 5 to 10 years, but some species have been known to live for decades. And I think the shocking part for me was 5 years. That seems very young.
Seems a bit short. So when you're talking about a grafted rose, something that has a top stalk and a rootstock, that graft point is the weakest part of the plant. And it tends to build up scar tissue around the crown or around that graft union over time. And that artificially limits the lifespan of the plant. So grafted roses typically have a shorter lifespan. Now, how short a lifespan? Well, I guess it depends on whether they own root themselves. Like if you've got that thing planted deep and the bottoms of those canes root themselves, then you don't have to worry about that root, the graft union anymore. It's on its own roots now. But own root roses tend to last a lot longer. And I'm not going to swear by this number, but I believe there is a specimen of rose that was growing on a castle wall or a monastery wall in Europe that is confirmed to be like 800 years old. So, and it's on its own roots. It's on its own roots, of course. So I think a grafted rose, we're probably looking at a useful life. I would probably estimate it more like 15 years.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much for having me.
Jason is just such a wealth of information, and I hope that you enjoyed that as much as I did. What it really comes down to is that you need to know your soil, and if you're new to gardening, it's difficult. And the easiest way to start and get a jump on it is to have a soil sample done. Find out if you're deficient in anything before you start adding nutrients to the rose, because it could end up doing more harm than good. And then after you've planted a rose and it's stable and accustomed to your native soil, then you can go ahead and play with some things, because that's part of the fun of gardening, isn't it? So thanks so much. I'll see you in the next one.